don't think we can hear you.
No, not hearing you. I saw you started the recording though, so if you give me a thumbs up, we'll just launch into it. Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is a work session for the board with the agency staff. Attendees from the public are welcome to observe. The chat function as well as the attendee cameras and microphones will be turned off. If you would like to submit public comment, please do that through the ODAV website for the April 3rd, 2025 board meeting. And with that, I'll turn it back to Alexis for the roll call.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Bill Gropp,
Here.
Jim Knight,
Here.
Sarah Lucas,
Present.
Steve Nagy, not currently in, so we'll see. Brian Prang.
Present.
Okay, and then looks also like Jeff Pritchard has not joined us yet either. And Catherine Stevens.
Present.
Okay, and we do have a quorum.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. And I will turn this over to Tony for discussion, presentation, and probably a Q&A around the state airports through the fence rule and policy evaluation. Tony.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. I did put together a presentation and I will try to run through it as quick as I can. We also sent out last week a packet with a staff report and then a few attachments that were included that are great reference or resource materials on Through the Fence at the federal and national level, and they include even references to some of our own airports. So I think they'll be great resources. Just really quick, in February, so last month in our regular board meeting, I shared an update that we had a handful of Through the Fence applications, but in reviewing those, we don't have, excuse me, any rulemaking or policy on how we would implement those outside of the pilot program. We have one airport, the Aurora State Airport, that's in the pilot program for commercial industrial Through the Fence. And again, outside of that, we don't have any rules in an administrative rule or policy explaining how we would implement that. We have a history of implementing Through the Fence and providing access agreements at several of our airports. And again, I'm just going to give a quick introduction on that. I'm going to share my screen. And can you all see that title screen? Okay, great. So in the staff report, I gave a background and a quick explanation of the issue and then objectives for this meeting. I don't expect that we're going to have answers to all of our questions in this meeting. Like Kenji said, this is the first of many conversations that we're going to have. So I will just kick it off. So just today, this presentation is just going to go over a quick overview of Through the Fence at our state airports, what this process is, the scope for it, the objectives for this meeting and out of this process, and then just a quick overview of some of the benefits and issues with Through the Fence, and then the guidance and input that we're seeking from the board to help form this public process as we go forward, and then what those next steps look like. So just really quick, the highlighted airports are the airports that we have Through the Fence access agreements at currently. Again, Aurora is included through statute in a pilot program for commercial industrial Through the Fence operations. The others are not. And we have active agreements at these airports, and we have requests for additional agreements at these and other airports as well. This is just a copy and paste from our May 2023 presentation in our May 2023 board meeting on leasing and Through the Fence. It just explains what Through the Fence is, what our access agreements do, and then how we have a table here that show the rates and fees that we charge for through the fence access. This is just a quick breakdown of the total access agreements that we have and at which airports, and for what uses, and that's going to come up a little bit later on the different types of uses for access agreements. And again, introduction for this process, this is just the start of what will probably be a fairly lengthy public outreach and rulemaking process. And we have through the fence applications, but again, no framework for policy outside of the pilot program on how and if they should be implemented or not. And again, as I shared in the February board meeting, we have a moratorium on through the fence pending the outcome of this rulemaking and policy update. So for this meeting and for this process, we are looking at state-operated airports outside of the pilot program only. This process is not intended to create rules for non-state airports or state-operated airports in Oregon. And the objectives are we're seeking answers and feedback to questions on that were in the staff report. And again, we do not expect answers today. But we are looking for board input here, and any feedback we can get will help form the and shape the focus of the public discussion that will follow. Moving on to benefits, these are well explained in the ACRP guidebook. This was attachment B in the packet that was sent out last week, and these benefits are also well known among the users through the fence here in Oregon and the private property owners near state airports. And we expect that we will continue to hear support for through the fence from those and other users here in Oregon as we have our public outreach. Issues are also well explained in the attachment A, the FAA Order 5196B, and in the ACRP guidebook on through the fence attachment B as well. And then I do have some in practice examples that go a little bit more hands-on than what's provided in those attachments, and I can run through those now. I am trying to run through this presentation fairly quickly. Happy to come back to any examples or provide more information as the discussion continues. So just in practice, some of the things we've seen firsthand with through the fence at our airports, when you don't have an actual fence, the distinction of public versus private land is not always apparent, and it can be really difficult actually. So the public, when using a public use airport, may not be aware of the fact that they might be either instructed by air traffic control in this instance, or may just be taxiing and want to turn around in a certain area, and they might be entering into private property they may not have permission to access. So that level of confusion is a factor with through the fence. It's also not having a fence makes it challenging to control access in wildlife at airports where, again, there may be very little space to put a fence, or may not be possible at all. This was a photo I shared back in the September work session on VPD rulemaking at Aurora. And again, this dashed line, the single dashed line, is our property line. And then just a matter of feet next to it is the movement line where our movement area begins. This is the Bandon State Airport. And again, the distinction of public versus private land is not apparent. I'm not going to throw questions out to you all, but I'm guessing you can't quite tell where it is. And I'm not sure if these photos help, or this one, or this one. But the property line is about a foot on this side of the hangar, all the way back along these rows of hangars. That's where our property line is located. So again, just not trying to say necessarily good or bad, but it presents some unique challenges, the way that through the fence has been implemented in the past. But in that case, the through the fence connects to a taxi lane or an apron. This is the Pinehurst State Airport, where we have direct access to the runway. We have about 4 different access points to the runway from private property. Presents FOD challenges. There's confusion and some issues with maintenance responsibilities of private use facilities on state property, because even with through the fence, it still requires private improvement on, again, public land on state land. And then again, here at the Pacific City State Airport, direct access, showing 2 of these direct access points to the runway on the south end. Other through the fence access is not direct to the runway, but connects to the apron. And I mentioned before that through the fence has a long history of being implemented in Oregon, so much so that there's an expectation that through the fence would be granted at most or any state airport in Oregon. This is photos from a listing of a large property west of the Independence State Airport, where they marketed the property without any coordination or communication with ODAV for the ability to develop through the fence. And they went as far as to show conceptual designs for through the fence layouts and, again, direct access to the runway. And as well as just aircraft use. This was a photo directly from their listing as well. The recent master plan for Independence shows that entire property being acquired by the state for on-state use. The east side of the airport, which is on the top end of the screen, it is nearly fully developed. I think we have one spot where we're planning for a hangar to be constructed on the northeast end of our property that doesn't currently exist. And outside of property acquisition on the south end and 2 hangar locations on the east side shown in this preferred alternative, all of the aeronautical development in the master plan is shown on that west side where that private property is. So what we're seeing in real time is the property values increasing and development occurring that is making it more challenging for the state to acquire property adjacent to the airport. This is the Joseph Airport. This is, I mentioned in February that we had received an application for through the fence access at Joseph, and this is what they submitted to us, showing a wide reciprocal easement for properties east of the airport. And again, in our recent master plan for Joseph, we're showing aviation development reserve on that east side as well. And then lastly, without policy or rules on how we implement through the fence, it has been implemented somewhat inconsistently. We have not had good framework for how we grant or deny through the fence access agreements. This is the Cottage Grove State Airport. And here on the midpoint of the airfield, we have one residence with a hangar with through the fence access. And then just a couple properties south, we have the frame of what is a fairly large hangar, but we have a similar private property that has attempted to obtain through the fence access for the Cottage Grove Airport, but I don't know all the details, but that was denied. And all I am aware of when I joined the department is that we denied them a request or their request for through the fence access. So I'm not aware of all the details, but again, I don't exactly know what objective criteria was used to not grant that person through the fence. Let's see. Other things, so talking about direct access to the runway, what kind of setbacks, going back to that Pinehurst example with development right next to the runway, these are just some of the issues that we're looking at without having that framework or rules or policy. So that brings us to the guidance and input that we're seeking. And those questions were laid out in the staff report. And when we raised this question, or when we brought the moratorium to the board last month, the question was asked by the board, well, I think, should we? That the first question we should be asking is, should we even do this? And this really is what sparked this conversation, that I think we need to have a little more discussion with the board before we convene the rulemaking advisory committee, and have a public process, and just having a little bit more guidance on what that process should be looking to accomplish. And so that also includes, should we consider access at some airports over others? Should some be exempt from through the fence access? Should we consider only granting certain types of through the fence access agreements? Again, I showed the different types of uses that we have, and they're also explained in the ACRP report. And then, and just that last example at Cottage Grove, what basis should we consider in granting or denying access agreements? And then how can we implement through the fence? If we're going to continue granting through the fence, how can we do that and protect the long-term interest of the airports, and prevent some of the challenges that I just ran through with our in practice examples? So next steps, that's it on my end for this presentation right now, but I really do look forward to a good discussion from the board. And if you're able to provide any input or guidance here, we look forward to a robust public discussion as we work through this rulemaking process.
I
All
just
right.
wanted to, just one really quick thing. I just wanted to state for the record that Steve and Jeff have joined us now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alexis. And Tony, thank you for that overview. And I appreciate all of the staff time that went into providing that report as well. And there are some good resources attached there. So hopefully folks had a chance to peruse some of those. So we'll just launch into questions here. And like Tony said, this is kind of our preliminary discussion around this. So all questions are good questions. And then eventually we'll need to give staff some direction on, forming the rulemaking committee and those kinds of things. So Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, Tony, really good job. I appreciate all of that information. It was a lot to go through, but it was really very helpful. You went through a lot of information this went real fast. So questions in my mind popped up at many of those slides. Could it get you go back to the process slide, which was towards the beginning of your presentation? It's like the third or fourth slide, I think.
Yeah, share my screen one more time. I'll do it more than one more time. I will share it again. Sorry. Is this the slide that you were asking about?
It's when you began. You had a different slide on the introduction in the process.
Okay. I believe that was here.
There you go. Okay. This is helpful. Talk about a complicated issues that we have to wade through. This is really significant, and I'm confident that we can do this. And I think that it's very difficult for me to want to begin to enter in a rulemaking process if we really haven't heard all of the voices that are necessary for us to give us guidance before we begin rulemaking. So from my perspective, I sure would like us to be clear what this process will be. What are the steps and when will they happen? So I would like to see a little more clarity, step by step, of what the process will be. So
thank you. I can definitely provide clarification there. So this meeting and this discussion, we were hoping to get some guidance from the board on kind of the temperature of what we would be looking to implement with through the fence, just generally. Establishing the rulemaking advisory committee and having that process, there will be public meetings. We'll get that public input from different airport users and through the fence users throughout Oregon. And we, will include board members in that rulemaking process as well. And then we would bring back the draft rule for the board's review and for adoption.
So do you anticipate there being, a workshop meeting in the very early beginning of this process that includes public comment? And when would that begin to, when do you see that be occurring?
Yeah, depending on the feedback that we get from you all, we were going to either establish a rulemaking advisory committee, which would be public meetings. We would get that public comment, and we would issue a public notice especially when we have the draft rulemaking ready for filing. Then that goes out for its own public comment period, and there's a public notice that goes with that. So. But then each step to get there, to get to the draft rulemaking or what that rule would look like, that's where I envision a robust public process that those rules would be based on. And again, including the board's feedback here.
So one more question, and I'll let others speak too. But so you're thinking that public process is a part of the rulemaking process, or in
Absolutely.
my mind, it would seem to be a good thing to have initial public input before the rulemaking process begins.
Right. I think we're saying the same thing. So there would be public input, and we would use that to develop the draft rules that then would be considered in the rulemaking advisory committee, which would be published through the public filing.
I'm sorry, Tony, could you say that one more time, please?
Yeah, so we're looking to include the board and the public in establishing a draft rule. That draft rule then goes through the public notice, which has its own public, again, the notice and then a rulemaking process, and then that public process and those draft rules come back to the board for the board's vote on adopting the rules or not.
All right, last question is, would there be a timeline that you could create of when these things would occur?
Yeah, so at the very end, we were looking at least, it's probably going to be at least a 12-month process. And again, I'm expecting a robust public process, and it will take multiple iterations of meetings and back and forth before we can even develop the draft rules.
All right, thank you for allowing these questions.
Yeah, and I would just say, Jim, also through the website, folks can submit comment, and also at board meetings, there's public comment opportunities. So it's not just during the rulemaking process, but also during our board meetings is the opportunity for people to provide comments or suggestions, that kind of thing.
Thank you,
Maggie, you were up next.
Thanks. Tony, good report and good background. The question I have is the rule in 738 Division 15, the access permit 10055, effective August, whatever it was, 2001. Right. Do you know the background for the impetus for that being inserted into the rule? Do we know the intent of why that was there? Because that's pretty clear about access permits. It'd be interesting to kind of understand the intent for that if we are thinking about changing this, to allow, because correct me if I am wrong, but the pilot program came along after that. So the pilot program basically allowed, even though there is this section of your administrative rules, the pilot program carved that out for very specifically for those pilot airports. But this is still in effect. This is your guidance.
Yeah, this is a current administrative rule, And to answer your question, I don't know the background. I'd have to go through old archives, but I haven't looked at those yet on what that discussion was for establishing this rule and barring through the fence at any airports where it's not established already. But this is the only rule that we do have on through the fence outside of the pilot program.
Right. And I guess I would say it would be very helpful if you could, or if some on the team, or if DOJ or whomever you would use could find out the background for the change for this administrative rule, how and why it came about. That would, I think, be helpful for guiding us in our discussion. Doesn't mean that has to be the be all and end all for it, but I think it'd be very helpful to understand how and why that came about and what that was intent. It's pretty close and it's pretty obvious in its intention to protect airports until the state airports until the property is leased up. But I'd like a little more background, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely we'll
Let's
get
give you
more
raise your
background here.
hand. Go ahead, Tony. I just saw Stacy raise her hand, so I think she might have an answer for it.
Okay. Go ahead, Stacy.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. I don't have a full answer, but the one thing that I want to point out, and I'm happy to look at that question for you, but the one thing I want to point out is the date of when this was adopted, 2002. So this was adopted before aviation was even carved out of Department of Transportation and its own agency created. And so I think that might have more to do with anything than, but again, I'm happy to look at it. That would require looking into ODOT's records. And I do have to tell you, I don't know how much of records they're actually going to have, because you have to look at when you're doing a rule, when you're doing this type of rule analysis, you have to look at the record that was before. At that point, it would have been the Oregon Transportation Commission when they adopted it. So again, happy to look at it. I just want to be prepared for that. And there's a possibility that it just might be a holdover from when the agency was carved out into its own independent agency.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
appreciate that, but it looks like because it very specifically lists a 2001 date and it's effective this date. And so as if there was some impetus for changing it, not just when it was carved out. The agency was, anyway, yeah, I think may not find it, but it might be helpful to understand.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. We will definitely take a look. And I did want to add too that some of the issues that I described and one several of them are at airports where we already have through the fence. So this OAR does not address that, where if it already has through the fence, it's possible that we would still look at granting through the fence. And so again, I think some of that policy or framework could help address some of the issues we're looking at too.
Right. Jeff Pritchard, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry, I was having a microphone problem. I just want to tag on to what board member Nagy was talking about. I'm also a big believer in trying to understand what the history of some of these decisions are. And I also appreciate that getting into the archives can be challenging, but as we move forward with this public process, I think it's important that not just for the board members, but for the public, we learn from how things or how and why things were done in the past. Because if we miss that, we might not make the right decision moving forward. So is it possible, Chair Stevens, to have any of that information be added to a place on the site where the public and the board can access it? And in addition to that, Mr. Beach did a really good job putting that presentation together. Is there a way to make that available as well, so that if anybody is curious about what happened in this discussion today, in addition to seeing the agenda item, they can see the topics that were covered. I think that'll be beneficial for everybody. And then, dovetailing on what Mr. Knight said, we need to make sure that we're very transparent and deliberate about our dates. And if we need more time than 12 months, I don't think we should force ourselves to 12 months, especially if we have very good dialogue with our local communities or other airports around the state. This is kind of a big deal, and I know it's personal for some. And when we look at our goals for the board and for Oregon Department of Aviation in general, economic development is one of those. So, making sure we get this right is really important. So thank you, Chair Stevens.
Thank you. And so if I could just address that comment, anything we do have on that rulemaking for that August 15th, 2001 date, anything we have would be public record, and we'll have to share it and get it posted out there for the public and the board's benefit. Oh, Catherine, no, we
Other
can't
raised
hear you.
hands?
Oh,
Oh,
there
really?
you go.
I've been having connectivity issues, so
You're back.
you can hear me now, though?
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right, I see Jim has his hand up again.
So, Tony, what do you tell people now well, this is a two-part question, is how many different airports, you see you've got 6 different requests right now, are they at multiple airports? State-owned,
Yeah.
obviously state-owned airports.
Mhm.
And so what do you tell folks now when they're approach you and say, here's what we'd like to do? I see the dilemma is you have no rules really to go by, but they're a legitimate request. So how do you handle those requests?
So right now we're communicating that, just as we shared in last month's board meeting, that we have a temporary moratorium on through the fence until we can establish these rules.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah.
Yes, thank you, Chair Stevens. I guess I just wanted to bring up some things to think about when we're going through this process that's related to through the fence, but not specifically, and that's our leasing process. I think some of the frustrations that some of our tenants or potential tenants have had is that they're on a wait list, but they're maybe number 3, and defining through this how long somebody has on the wait list if they are the number 1 to build, but they're not doing anything to then go through the list to help develop the on-airport properties. And then also the definition of what does it mean for the state to be fully developed. The Independence and Joseph examples that we had, what we currently own is pretty well built out with maybe 1 or 2 locations left to lease, but we've identified future property for acquisition. So the definition of fully developed, does that include properties identified in the master plan? So I just think that's just something that we should be thinking of during the rulemaking process. That's again more towards the planning and leasing, but would impact through the fence issues.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to keep watching for hands up, but I will ask Tony, for me, I think a lot of this is, it comes down to fundamentals, right? It should be consistency with our airport master plans, safety and security. So I think, as you pointed out in at least one of the slides, marketing that was being done, to promote a potential through the fence opportunity that was in complete, opposite of what the master plan was showing for that airport. And I think that's really, so it's a kind of a tandem thing that we need. We need a through the fence policy, but we also need to make sure that that policy is consistent with the master plans for each of these airports. And then safety wise, I think this is really why the FAA frowns on through the fence in general. It is, these accesses that are not controlled. And I know that's been part of the issue at Aurora with all of our vehicle incursion incidents. So I don't know if you can elaborate on that at all about the impacts that, through the fence at Aurora it has had around safety.
Yeah, the so we shared and we should have the recording for that September work session on specific to VPDs and rulemaking for Aurora. There was a really robust discussion and presentation there. But as a quick recap, I'm just trying to go back to that slide. Um, so Through the Fence has facilitated a lot of aeronautical development on private property. And in some ways, it's the victim of its own success. It has grown so much that the airport has really grown, the use has really grown. It's been successful. It's just a matter of question of implementation and was it done right? And so in this case, again, I mentioned the private our property line is this yellow dashed line, and then just a matter of feet um, is our controlled access or our movement area. And there are some challenges with controlling access. Our documents, our access agreements, in my opinion, are fairly robust. We do have good access agreements. I included a template in the attachment as well. I believe it was attachment E. And it does talk about responsibilities for the property owners to control the access point and to exercise control and prevent the unauthorized use of the access point. Um, but just inherently, with anything we do, there's challenges, and I think we can learn from them and we can improve. But right now, so great comments here about meeting the FAA, our federal obligations, and then great question or comments about addressing safety challenges, security, access control. They're all things that we'll be looking at throughout this process. Looking at our current access agreements, what can we change? How can we improve? And then I did want to go back. So this is Bandon, and I didn't have time to include this graphic, but we have Through the Fence here. And this is also the case at Aurora as well, where it's sort of becoming Through the Fence on top of Through the Fence. All the frontage to the airport is either developed or already has Through the Fence, but then maybe the property behind it wants to add Through the Fence. And in this case, our master plan shows an airport road going through here, and this would be the main airport access. With we would do some property acquisition, and we would build our new airport road over here. Well, just last year, we had somebody came to us, met with us, said they've already acquired some of this property with the anticipation of just being granted Through the Fence. But our master plan shows that as being our property acquisition and again, vehicle access. So it does make for some challenges. I think adding some clarification, having some framework for us to explain when we won't grant Through the Fence will help not only us be more effective with Through the Fence, but also prevent people from unfortunately getting in positions where, they're making financial decisions and maybe it's not going to work the way they were hoping.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tony. Brian Pranger.
Chair. I think we'll eventually get to the should question, but right now, the independence example is really interesting. So there's a question for you, Tony. You have shown that it was for sale. You've also
Right.
shown that it is part of our development plan. And I think I heard that we're essentially, maybe depending on the definition, fully developed. So you said that it's hard for the state to actually acquire that property because of value and whatnot. So I'm curious, was that ever a real consideration within the agency right now to buy it? Because everything's lined up where that should be the case, and if the state can't, then not allowing the through the fence is then nothing happens. So I'm just kind of curious about the decision process when that came up for sale. How does the agency decide its priority and ability to acquire?
Right. Yeah, so that comes through the master plan, which was recently completed. And because the airport is so developed, it was on the CIP in the master plan for the property acquisition, but then when it was listed for sale, we put it on our CIP. We tried to work with the FAA to get funding. We were estimating about the $2.5 million that this was a screenshot of the listing, and we were working to acquire it. But then they were also showing this potential for private development, which attracted you know, people who are interested in developing to turn a higher profit. But that's based on the issuance of a future through the fence agreement, which was not what we were intending to do because we were working toward acquiring the property. So it just complicated it, but we believe the property did sell just last summer.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Jim?
So can we talk about the FAA's position, Tony? Is as I read through the attachment of the FAA, instructions and their position really on the issues that need to be addressed in the through the fence agreements. I don't have the sense, honestly, that the FAA is against through the fence, but they are very clear and wisely so from my perspective about the issues that we must address through the fence agreement. And so what's your thoughts? What's your sense from the FAA of whether or not they are opposed to through the fence or they're ambivalent about it as long as we follow their guidelines? How do you see that?
The FAA's position on through the fence, I think, has evolved a little bit back and forth over time. It's changed. I wasn't around in aviation back when I believe they had a stricter opposition to through the fence. But the best guidance we can go off of right now is directly from the FAA anyway, is attachment A, that FAA order 5190.6b. And no, they don't prohibit through the fence altogether. There are some cases where they don't allow through the fence at certain type of airports, or there are certain uses that the FAA I basically characterized as being against an airport sponsor's grant assurances or their federal obligations. And specifically, they mention residential through the fence and compatible land uses for airports. So that, they do have a fairly strong position there. Oregon is not unique in having commercial through the fence. There are other airports throughout the country where there is fairly significant through the fence, even on par with Aurora. But generally, and I'm Catherine mentioned the FAA earlier as well, and so I'll let you all kind of give your opinions here. But generally, the FAA, while they can't prohibit through the fence, I don't believe they're very supportive. And then just to add on that, our discussions with the FAA directly, while they haven't said, we're in violation of any of our federal obligations, they definitely have had their concerns, and we're continuing to work with them to address that.
Tony, it might be helpful if for the requests that you currently have that are now subject to the moratorium, if you could kind of let us know what those look like, which airports, what are the requests, just a general overview.
Good idea.
Yeah, I can provide more information on each individually in a future meeting. Just really quick, if I can scroll through. We already mentioned Joseph, and this was an exhibit that again was included in that Through the Fence application from just last year. So that is one, and that's my understanding is that it's multiple properties. There are multiple people who are interested in Through the Fence at Joseph, and that's why they're showing the wide reciprocal easement is as part of their request. Even beyond, just the boundaries of this particular property for the applicant. And then trying to find, I think it's further back. At Pacific City, we do have a handful of Through the Fence that are, one I believe is new and one or two that are renewals of expired Through the Fence agreements. And then again, I mentioned the Bandon one that where they recently purchased a property.
And what's been the timeline on those requests? Has it been over the last year, longer than that?
The Pacific City are beyond a year. The rest are within the last year.
Okay. And are you seeing just more requests? Like hadn't seen some in a while and now we're seeing more, or I'm just trying to gauge kind of where the activity is coming from.
I really couldn't say how it compares prior to the last couple of years, but I couldn't say if it's like an uptick or if it's just consistent, but it seems fairly steady.
Thank you. All right, other questions? Jim?
Yeah. Tony, do you have any economic impact data or information regarding what happens when Through the Fence development occurs at an airport and how does it economically impact that community? Is this a good thing overall for the community to have, or do we have any information at all that could kind of guide us? As my suspicion, and it's just a suspicion, is that when there is more development next to the airport, and the development included Through the Fence access, and putting aside the challenges that occur at that point, but it would seem to me that this is a good thing for us to work hard towards finding ways to make this work. If the supposition is correct, is that it has a very positive effect on the community of which that these airports exist. So I'm guessing you don't have a lot, but is it feasible to get information so they say, in cases where we've allowed Through the Fence development, it has a very positive effect, not only on, or negative, on the community, but how does it affect the pocketbook for the Department of Aviation? We could use the money, certainly, but I don't have a sense of, is this a good thing economically for us or not?
Right. We do collect some fees on Through the Fence, so on access. And one thing in the FAA Order 5190.6b, the FAA talks about the need to capture at a minimum a commensurate amount for on-airport development. So yes, it does generate revenue for aviation or for the department. And there are benefits, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and they're also well explained in the ACRP. There are reasons that people really like Through the Fence, um, and so um, so we're aware of those benefits, and we have, to answer your question on economic impact, we have part of our Oregon Aviation Plan economic impact sections on a couple of our airports, specifically Aurora and a handful of others. I don't know if it breaks out in great detail how much of that is from Through the Fence versus on airport development. But generally, yes, there's reasons people prefer to develop on their own private property. They don't have to, they feel they don't have to, worry about their private improvements being taken over by the airport sponsor, as is typical where they have reversion. And they're willing to invest a little more in their improvements because it's on their own property, and it's attractive for a lot of people. So, and I talking about that pilot program on Through the Fence, my understanding is that was the focus of that, creating that pilot program to stoke economic development and industrial and commercial aeronautical uses, which again was, I believe, very effective, as I mentioned earlier.
Tony, you mentioned that, the FAA order saying that the Through the Fence fee should be commensurate with whatever the revenue to an airport would be if it was an on-airport development. So of the Through the Fence agreements that we have currently, are we capturing that full amount that we would have otherwise captured if those developments were on airport property?
It's a really good question. So the FAA looks at a couple examples with whether it's tie-down fees versus just hangar storage. And on tie-down fees, yeah, our tie-down fees are not very high, and they're fairly similar to the rates that I showed earlier here on this slide, with the minimum guarantee, whether it's the monthly charge per aircraft or based on category of airport. So yes, in that regard, I do. If we're looking at hangar storage, then depending on how many aircraft are in the hangar, depending on if the size of some of these access agreements cover significant amount of hangar coverage or hangar storage space, and what that equivalent for what could be dozens of aircraft worth of hangar storage, that's a little more gray. What I've shared before is that we have been working to update our land lease rents, our rates that had not been escalated in some cases over 12 years. And we're caught up. We have caught those up. We have applied and worked through the last year all of the CPI escalations, and through this process, I imagine we'll take a look at closely looking at how the Through the Fence rates compare.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm sure that some further analysis is needed. And now that we're just starting kind of to the review of this Through the Fence policy. Now, Brian.
Thank you. Speaking to kind of maybe the economic development question, the airport that we operate at has kind of this question is always on our mind. We have some Through the Fence. There's other people that want them. It's a public-private partnership, not a state-owned airport. So it's all on our local level. And there's a lot of the public-private tension. And I just want to speak to that from kind of a voice of a rural airport. When I look at the examples provided by you, Tony, I see Aurora as a wild exception, not something to make rulemaking around, just because of the constraints and the way that has grown is very, very unique. where a lot more of, I think, the intent of through the fence would be a controlled access point. And then how does the state benefit from that, and how does the private entity benefit from that? In your template lease exhibit, the fee structure is almost not even worth the administrative expense as I look at it. Most of the aircraft I operate would be $15 a month. And that seems like there's an opportunity to change that. And at our level, we've thought about different ways to connect that through the fence agreement to more like a land lease. What's the square footage of an access point? What has been built there, improving it. There's a lot of other ways that we can do it, but my kind of opinion and default position is if the state isn't in a position to do it, or in our case, if our public agency isn't in a position to build hangars, satisfy the commercial demand, they very much been an impediment of our economic development of our area. And that's that tension that we have locally that has been, as a user and operator, very frustrating. And I think my ask to the board is really consider a path forward of how do we do it, as opposed to really considering the idea that the state of Oregon does not do it. And I could go into more of that stuff, but that's what I wanted to present.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Brian. And because we have the pilot program, which does cover Aurora, this process really is focused at all of the other airports. Now, some of that could affect how through the fence is implemented at Aurora, but it's really not focused on looking at that pilot program specifically. So we are looking at a lot of our rural airports. I mentioned a few of our current applications are for Pacific City, very small airport, and then again, Pinehurst, which I have here on the screen. So it is, again, primarily looking at the other 27 out of our 28 airports that we operate.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate your comments on, some of the frustrations and fees and everything. That's where, going back to the questions from the staff report, one question is do or do not. The other questions are how. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity for improvement. I don't have any preconceived ideas of the outcome of this process, but I do look forward to continuing discussions with the board and the public on, if we're going to do it, how can we address some of these issues and make it done better.
It seems like a tiered approach could be beneficial, because I don't think it's in the state's interest to be highly developing an airport like you have photo example here. So leveraging private funds to maintain that health of aviation in that area, but that comes with a minimum standards of access and whatnot. And as the airport gets into something like Aurora, which is very established and has all these access issues and, like you said, wildlife and the movement areas, that is a much different looking, more constrained through the fence agreement process than something that's more rural, less risk. And I think that that's balanced against the priorities of the state and the fiscal use of your budget to develop. And I'm not sure where something like Independence lands in that. It just sold, so the likelihood of that coming up for sale again is minimal, or at least maybe not, maybe. But these are the tensions that I'm thinking about.
Right. So minimum standards are a great example of one way that we can look at, again, answering those questions of how and then are we going to have different levels of expectations or standards or procedures for different airports that we have. for sure.
All right, great questions. I think we probably have a lot more to consider in all of this, but I think this has been a very good overview and start of the discussion. I'm just kind of pausing to see if anyone else has a raised hand. I know this is kind of a lot to contemplate. And then, great, Tony, do you want to just kind of walk us through what our next steps will be then again?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from the board is that there are, I've been taking notes as we've been going through, and so we definitely have more questions. We have some things we can provide clarification, and we'll be getting that information, bringing that to the board in a future meeting. But I'm also hearing that there are benefits, and we recognize that, and there's reasons that we may still look at continuing through the fence. And so but maybe we can just improve how it's done, or ways to look out, applying them differently for different airports. So next steps, we will provide the clarification and information requested. We will bring that to a future board meeting. And then I think that's going to be, just off the top of my head here, that's probably the next best step that we can do. And then from that discussion, and after you all have had a little more time to kind of contemplate everything that we discussed here, I would really be looking for some, I'm guessing, getting the rulemaking advisory committee together and putting together some draft rules based on this feedback that we've had today, and then in future meetings as well.
Yep, that sounds like a good plan forward, Tony. I would just say, what it might be helpful, in addition to the other things that you noted to bring back to the board, it would be helpful to kind of have a distilled, info sheet that references, Order 5190, the ACRP recommendations, and then kind of our current snapshot of the Oregon administrative rules that maybe aren't providing all of the clarity we need at this point, but it would be helpful, instead of trying to shift back and forth all of these, some of them rather large documents, to just kind of distill it down for us, so that we have a starting point again for our next discussion.
Definitely. Yep.
Tony, another suggestion for staff is you might want to consider a risk analysis type approach to some of the how you would evaluate applications also.
Jim, you had another question, comment?
Yeah, Tony, I just want to reiterate, I think it would be very helpful for all of us and the public, is that as soon as possible, is that we get together a timeline that's publicly available that shows us what these next steps are and when they occur. So I know we talked about that before, but don't want that to slip through the cracks.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And, in this presentation and on the slide I'm showing now, we're anticipating about 12 months. As you mentioned earlier, it is going to be an evolving process, and we, more than anything, want robust process and public input, as well as the board's input. So it's not, I'm not looking at just rushing something through in 12 months necessarily. If we need more time, we'll take more time. It will be an evolving process. So I don't have a very set schedule, but I plan to bring next steps to you in the next board meeting.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. Are you sure you want to go through this?
That's doing my job.
Our constituents are asking for this, right? For this consideration, and we're just trying to be as thoughtful as we can, and make some smart policy decisions around how we go about addressing the requests And I would just encourage, anyone from the public to submit comment, because it will be helpful to us to hear from folks from the community. And that will, of course, be a part of the rulemaking process as well. But I think if folks have some initial thoughts for the board, that would be helpful.
And Tony, I want you to know you're not alone in all of this. Speaking for myself, I'm willing to help with anything that I can, and so don't hesitate to reach out if you've got questions, or if there's a task that needs to be accomplished that you need some input from. I would think most of our board members feel the same way. Is that we really want you to feel supported as well.
Well, I appreciate that, and know you all are included in this too. So we're certainly going to have more involvement with the board, and then keeping you all updated and up to speed along the way. So thank you for that support, and yeah, just getting, as Catherine and you said, getting responsive to the needs of our Oregonians and our pilots here throughout the state, hoping that we'll have a better process for through the fence at the end of this. So thank you.
Good job.
All right, thank you. Kenji, anything you'd like to say before we close out this work session?
No, not really. I mean, this is a great discussion, and just hearing the opinions of everybody. Like Brian, you brought up some great ideas. Jim, you as well. Sarah, Steve, Jeff, everybody. It's great, and like I said before, it's the beginning of the conversation, right? And there's, I think what's going to be important is we do two things. We have clarity, consistency, and a fair process, right? We want to hear from everybody, not just the true defensors, not just the economic development folks, but also the communities involved as well. Because when it comes down to it, we live in a community, so we want to make sure that we're instituting policies that make sense, right? So I think more than anything, I'm really stoked. It's going to be a hard conversation, but that's okay, because when you have hard conversations, you come out with better solutions. So I'm really excited for this, and I'm looking forward to working with everybody and making sure we come out with something that works for everybody. So thanks.
Thank you, Alexis. Good job today.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. Nice to see everybody. Our next board meeting will be next month, and I have Aurora, right? Or not Aurora, sorry, Astoria, right?
Yep.
Yes,
All
on
right,
April
looking
3rd.
forward to that.
Yeah.
Very good. All
Looking
right,
forward.
thanks so much. We will adjourn.
All right.
Thank you. Enjoy the weather.